Episode 3, we mentioned the United States government's creation and use of the Committee on Public Information, also known as the Creel Committee, in 1917 as a propaganda machine to shape popular support for the United States' involvement in World War I. That piece of history has more to teach us, and that is where we began this exciting episode. Setting the stage for a tiny piece of the complicated World War I history in one short podcast episode is like expecting a worm to fly after explaining the basic aerodynamics of an airfoil. It's hard unless you've got a smart, talented worm. Now, I trust my listeners are smart and talented. Being a worm is optional. This podcast starts with the punchline. First, I lay a brief foundation. World War I was fought from July the 28th, 1914 to November the 11th, 1918 between the Allied powers, that's Great Britain, France, Russia, and some others, and the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. The war was fought on land in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, France, Russia, and Italy. It was fought on the Atlantic, Pacific, Indian, and Arctic Oceans, and various connected seas. It lasted 4 years, 3.5 months, 222 weeks, resulting in 15 to 22 million deaths. That averages about 9,650 to 14,160 deaths each day. The United States maintained a position of neutrality and isolationism towards the war until 5.5 months before the war ended, when we declared war on Germany and engaged in combat. During our short active combat mission in the war, the United States lost over 120,000 soldiers. Notwithstanding the government's position on neutrality and isolationism, the private economic sector of the United States backed the Allied powers, Britain and France in particular, very heavily throughout the war, contributing billions of dollars in aid, military supplies, and loans backed by collateral. Trade with European countries remained important to the United States companies and the U.S. economy throughout the war. Several notable events occurred in early 1917 that caused a major shift in the United States' attitude on neutrality and isolationism. As a result, the U.S. declared war on Germany on April the 6th, 1917. Within a week of that event, President Wilson created the Committee on Public Information under the direction of George Creel to generate public support for the war, raise liberty bonds, quell dissent to the war effort, and increase patriotism. However, within 2 months, the Creel Committee became a propaganda campaign of fearmongering, fake news, exaggeration, and censorship of free speech. The Creel Committee successfully changed public sentiment towards the war. It helped finance it and achieved its stated objective, according to most historians. It also is widely accepted that the committee's tactics cultivated a climate of fear and suppressed legitimate dissent that damaged the committee's reputation and further damaged public trust in our democracy. The lesson we should learn from Woodrow Wilson's use of the Creel Committee in World War I can be summed up in one sentence. Government-sponsored propaganda destroys public trust. Now let's talk about how it did that. First, the Creel Committee was the United States government's first use of a large-scale, centralized, government-sponsored propaganda agency specifically dedicated to persuading or to manipulate rather than provide neutral information to its citizenry. Unfortunately, Among other valuable information, it presented highly emotional, exaggerated, and one-sided portrayals of the war. It characterized the war as a crusade of pure good versus pure evil. It grossly exaggerated claims about atrocities, engaged in fearmongering, and created fake news. It contributed to mob violence, book burnings, and other harm that lingered long after the end of the war. Once Americans discovered how overblown or misleading the depictions were, it damaged confidence in government honesty. Second, coupled with the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, which were passed during the war, the CPI functioned to equate disloyalty with dissent, causing citizens who exercised their First Amendment right of speech to be silenced or even jailed. That eroded public trust in the government's respect for democratic freedoms. The CPI messaging did not just inform, it intentionally manipulated public opinion and engineered consent. When people realized what had happened, they questioned if they could ever trust the government to tell them the unvarnished truth. Third, perhaps the most damaging long-term effect of the Creel Committee, government propaganda blurred the line between truthful civic information and political propaganda. The CPI harmed public trust because it prioritized persuasion over truth. Trust is a fragile resource in a democracy. Once lost, it is very hard to rebuild. Now let me explain the rationale underlying these conclusions. That will involve a review of some World War I history. Let's start with a little-known fact. Did you know that World War I started because of a wrong turn? That's what some people say. The annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina by Austria-Hungary in 1908 did not sit well with the Serbs or the Russians. It festered until June 28, 1914, when a Serbian extremist group attempted to assassinate the Archduke of Austria, Franz Ferdinand, the presumptive heir to Emperor Franz Joseph I, in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. The assassination failed, but injured 2 men in his motorcade. Later that day, on the Archduke's return from the hospital to visit the injured men, his car took a wrong turn onto a street where a Serb student shot and killed the Archduke and his wife, Sophia. That pissed off a lot of people and stirred up an already long-standing volatile situation. A month later, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia joined Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia and France, who had an alliance, and Germany invaded Belgium, which brought the United Kingdom into the war against Germany. The Ottoman Empire, Italy, Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, and others entered the war thereafter. That got the First World War started. Even though the United States did not officially declare war against Germany until April 6, 1917, many other countries were involved. Remember, during this period of history, some of the main players, like Great Britain, France, Germany, and the Ottoman, were empires, which meant they were not a single country. Instead, they had countries or territories all over the world under their partial or total control. The political and governmental climates around the world were different in other ways also back then. First, democracies were rare in 1914 when World War I began. Only 3 European countries had republics at that time: Switzerland, France, and Portugal. The United Kingdom had a constitutional monarchy with parliamentary democracy. Otherwise, monarchies were the norm. Second, America possessed vast resources and potential, but had a small army, was unprepared for war, and maintained a policy of strict neutrality and isolationism. It had undergone a massive transformation during the Second Industrial Revolution, or Gilded Age, through technological advancement like the incandescent light bulb, telephone, the assembly line, and a transcontinental railroad. It was a country transitioning from a rural to an industrialized and urbanized nation. Third, the labor force in America was made up of millions of newly arrived immigrants. Many were from Europe. American society had quickly become more diverse than ever before. It was marked by a high concentration of excess wealth, widespread political corruption, growing inequality, growth towards labor unions, and farm hardship. It was more accurate in 1914 to call America a baby giant sleeping than Admiral Yamamoto's classic reference 2 decades later to awakening a sleeping giant. Fourth, European intellectuals and political leaders doubted our democracy's ability to govern modern mass societies and gave favor to nationalism, hierarchy, and military discipline. And fifth, Woodrow Wilson, our president, and most Americans favored isolationism and neutrality because there was no direct threat to the United States, and because the U.S. had no obligation to fight pursuant to an alliance agreement. However, as a neutral party, the United States was supposedly guaranteed the ability to trade freely with its European trading partners and the belligerents, provided the United States remained neutral, although I found no history of a document to that effect. Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president, was a unique fella. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Princeton University in 1879. Thereafter, he attended the University of Virginia Law School, but left after 1 year without a degree, finding the practice of law unsuited to his interest. He then earned a Ph.D. in History and Political Science from Johns Hopkins University in 1886, making him the only U.S. president to hold a doctorate degree. He was a professor at Princeton and later served as its president from 1902 to 1910, when he was elected governor of New Jersey. As the 28th President of the United States, he was responsible for passage of the Revenue Act of 1913, that's the Income Tax Act, the Federal Reserve Act, the Child Labor Reform Act, and legislation supporting unions to ensure fair treatment for working Americans. He allowed the Secretary of Treasury and the Postmaster General to segregate their departments. He also allowed Jim Crow laws to be put into place in Washington, D.C. There was a real current of anti-democratic sentiment in America during the World War I era that evolved from the transitions through the Reconstruction Era from 1865 to 1877, the Gilded Era, also known as the nadir of race relations in America, from 1877 to 1901, the Industrial Revolution from 1876 to 1900, and the Progressive Era from 1890 to 1913. That Wilson needed to generate support for entry into the war is not seriously disputed. As a historian, he knew, or should have known, why there was so much anti-democratic sentiment. The 49 years between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of World War I had combined multiple lifestyle changes, dynamic social turmoil, unbelievable disparity in wealth, unrestrained political and governmental accountability, unchecked public corruption, massed westward migration, and little to no reason for an ordinary citizen to trust the governments or its leaders. and this will be the subject of subsequent episodes. Most historians agree that Wilson had valid reasons to enter the war when he did. First, on January 16, 1917, the United States intercepted a telegram from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico, proposing an alliance whereby Mexico would recover most of the territory it lost in the Mexican-American War in exchange for joining Germany against the United States. Second, on January the 31st, 1917, it was made public that the German Emperor Wilhelm II would resume unrestricted submarine warfare on the high seas, which had been abated at the United States' insistence. That would interrupt U.S. trade. The third reason is one that is sometimes conveniently overlooked. As you may recall, Wilson won his second term on the campaign pledge to keep us out of the war. Even after the Zimmermann telegram was discovered and Emperor Wilhelm's decision to unleash his submarine attacks, Wilson did not change his mind. Many historians believe one additional thing coalesced to change it. It was political ties to the extremely wealthy who had elected to extend credit to the Allies, particularly Britain and France. And there is factual support for that argument. During the first 3 years of the war, the United States private sector played a major role in providing economic aid, loans, and material support to the Allied powers, especially Britain and France. From 1914 through 1916, the aid flowed mainly through private U.S. banks and companies. U.S. exports to the Allies jumped from about $825 million at the beginning of the war to over $3.2 billion by the end of 1916. U.S. banks, especially J Morgan and Company, by 1917 had loaned Britain $2.3 billion and France $1.2 billion. United States arms exports alone had grown from $40 million in 1914 to over $1.2 billion in 1916. And by April 1917, the United States economy was heavily tied to an Allied victory, financially and industrially. Beginning in early 1917, the United States aid to the Allies dropped sharply because Britain and France were running out of gold reserves and collateral to secure private United States loans. Wilson, who had a Ph.D. in history from Johns Hopkins University, understood what was happening. President Wilson did not flinch on his opposition to the war until the financial/political influence occurred. He then immediately gave his speech to Congress on April the 2nd, 1917, asking for a declaration of war. In response, Congress immediately declared war on Germany on April the 6th, 1917. Whether that conclusion is justified or not, Wilson either expressly authorized or tactically approved Creel's dramatic change in propaganda tactics within 2 months of the initiation of that campaign. He hired Creel. He was responsible for him, and he could have fired him. He did not. According to many historians, its damage can still be seen today. It pioneered modern large-scale propaganda techniques, encouraged mass hysteria and intolerance, introduced and legitimized government-manipulated information, influenced future propaganda efforts, created a model for modern public relations, and fostered a culture of surveillance and suppression of dissent. Joseph Goebbels, Nazi Germany's propaganda minister, acknowledged using Creel's tactics. Wilson may not have needed a quick fix, but the price our country paid for it is too high, and we must finally learn our lesson that government-sponsored propaganda destroys public trust. Thank you for listening to this episode of Fixing America with J Mel. Remember to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe. See you next time. Be safe and resist.